The North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, has developed a detailed action plan in case of an armed conflict with Russia. The document is called the NATO Ground Combat Operations Concept. And this happened literally 3 days after information appeared in Western media that Vladimir Putin had set a goal for his own special services to destroy NATO and the European Union from within by 2026. It seems the alliance decided to respond not secretly, but as publicly as possible. So in this episode, let's break down exactly what's in this NATO plan in case of war with Russia, and which programs the alliance has already implemented, and which ones are currently in the process of being implemented. My name is Alexei Piechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Check right now under this video if you're subscribed. Maybe you've been watching my episodes for a long time, but you might have forgotten to subscribe, so please take a second of your time, subscribe, and I will be very grateful to you for that. So let's start with who developed the NATO document and what its logic is. The development of the concept was led by American Major Andrew Pingree. The NATO document describes three main strategies that NATO can and will use if an open war with Russia begins. And the basic scenario being considered is a Russian offensive against the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. The first stage of NATO's plan is to counteract directly at the approaches. The alliance intends to use fighter jets, missiles and drones to disable Russian missile systems. One of the main targets specifically mentioned is the Kaliningrad region, where air defense systems and missile weapons are deployed. That is, in theory, the first strike would be delivered specifically against this exclave squeezed between Poland and Lithuania. NATO is prepared to neutralize the Kaliningrad region first, up to and including capturing this territory and taking control over it. The second element of the first stage is the creation of a so-called autonomous zone along the borders with Russia and Belarus. This is a protective barrier where it is planned to use only drones and autonomous equipment. And the Ukrainian military, I emphasize, the heroic Ukrainian military, call this area the kill zone. In NATO, this was called the autonomous zone. There are no plans to station NATO personnel in this zone at all. If Russian units continue to advance, they are expected to be held back specifically by drones and robots, without direct engagement of personnel. And here you can understand that this autonomous zone is not just an abstract idea on paper, but a direct development of an ongoing process that we mentioned in previous episodes. Back in September of last year, after about 20 Russian combat drones invaded Polish airspace, literally a day before the speech of the head of the European Commission on the state of affairs in the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen publicly supported the concept of a drone wall for the entire eastern flank, and now it is being actively implemented. So the idea is to completely build a drone wall along the entire border with Russia and Belarus. Since then, the project has been named Eastern Flank Watch. According to the American publication Defense News, as part of NATO's experimental program, the effective size of this autonomous zone is already being worked out. It varies depending on the terrain. Latvian military personnel are already training daily to hold such a zone using only unmanned systems, relying on terminology borrowed directly from Ukrainian experience. Because in the armed forces of Ukraine, a similar strip along the front line, which is fully under drone and artillery fire for 15 kilometers or more, is informally called the kill zone or zone of destruction. The official representative of the alliance, whose last name is Murray, formulated the logic of the three-stage deterrence as follows. Quote, "The first step is to deter them. The second is to stop them. The third is to put them in a position where they have to change their formation, and it is at that moment that they become truly vulnerable." Now let's talk about what happens if the first line of defense doesn't work and the enemy, namely the wild, unwashed Russian, still advances. The next stage of the plan involves strikes on military targets and supply points directly on Russian territory itself. Potential targets include airfields, defense industry facilities, bridges, and railway infrastructure used for troop transfers. To deliver drones and robotic equipment deep into Russian territory, it is planned to use air transport, that is, airdropping. And here is a separate and very telling element of this plan. The focus is not only on equipment, but also on people inside Russia itself. In particular, the alliance intends to deploy special forces units and is counting on possible support from Russians who oppose their own government. Their actions are meant to disrupt the supply of Russian troops and make it more difficult to carry out offensive operations. At the same time, the document clearly states a fundamental limitation, but they wouldn't be Westerners if they didn't add that. NATO does not aim to occupy Russia. The point is only to stop the offensive and push the troops back to the border. So the plan is defensive, according to its stated goal, even if it includes strikes deep into Russian territory. But you may have the same main question that I did. Why did NATO decide to reveal the details of this plan publicly at all? After all, military concepts of this level are usually kept secret, and according to Bild, the publication of the main elements of the concept is supposed to serve as a deterrent. Russia should understand in advance exactly what consequences it will face if it attacks a member of the alliance. This is the classic logic of nuclear and conventional deterrence. That is, not to hide the plan to preserve the element of surprise, but on the contrary, to show it to the enemy as openly as possible, so that the very possibility of aggression looks obviously doomed to fail. Although it should be understood that behind this open part of the plan there is obviously a secret strategy that will not be revealed to the Russians. And here's a funny story for you. The Russian authorities have repeatedly stated that Moscow does not intend to attack a NATO member. Let me remind you, back in 2023, even in 2022. And actually, every year, Putin personally said that Russia has, quote, neither geopolitical, nor economic, nor military reasons for a war with NATO. But you all should remember what a Russian is like. A Russian, and Putin is one, is a deceitful being whom you absolutely cannot trust. This same Vladimir Putin and his entire entourage assured that Russia would never, ever attack Ukraine. This same Putin assured that there were some little green men in Crimea, and that there was no Russian army in Donbass. And that same creature, Vladimir Putin, assured that it was Ukraine that attacked Russia, and that's why Russia is only defending itself. Come on. He says, we didn't start the war, they did, Ukraine just went and attacked us. That's why, thank God, people in Europe have also stopped believing the Russians. Everyone understands. How can you believe, for example, a horse like Sergei Lavrov? How can you believe a balding wretch like Vladimir Putin? How can you believe a drunkard like Dmitry Medvedev? In general, how can you trust Russians after they themselves have broken all their promises, words and so on millions of times? Everyone remembers that very, very old video, back at the beginning of the presidential term. Even during the very first election campaign, when Putin was supposedly running for office. Well, we all understand what elections in Russia really are. He said, what are you talking about? We would never attack Ukraine. No. What are you talking about? That's impossible. Then, in 2014, he was saying that there were some little green men in Crimea who bought their uniforms at a military surplus store. And then, after a year and a half or two, he says, well, yeah, the Russian army was there. Just think about how cowardly this creature is. That's what he thought, until they fully secured control over those territories. Let's pretend it wasn't us. But when he realized they had already taken over, he was like, well, okay, yeah, it was us. Basically, the point is that you can never trust Russians at all, ever in your life. The bottom line. On one hand, we have a documented, detailed and now publicly revealed NATO military concept built on the real combat experience of the armed forces of Ukraine in Ukraine, including the already tested technology of autonomous zones along the eastern border. On the other hand, we have repeated official assurances from Moscow that it does not plan to attack the alliance. But for some reason, it is preparing bases for attacks and organizing sabotage across Europe. But the very persistence with which NATO decided to make such a detailed plan public right now, just 3 days after reports about Putin's goal to undermine the alliance from within, speaks for itself. Fortunately, trust in these assurances from Moscow has diminished so much in Western headquarters that they found it necessary to show their hand to the enemy in advance. Not to scare them ahead of time, but so that Moscow has no illusions about the price of any attempt to test Article 5. However, to test its strength, I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.